on migration and on people on the move. We have gathered today a very, very distinguished two panels of people who are experts on this subject. They will build national perspectives, general perspectives, and will actually contribute to our conversation. And with that, I would like to thank you all for coming, and also thank the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, who has helped put the research and this event together. Thank you very much for supporting us in this. And so what we're going to do this morning is we are going to first allow our own researchers to present the results of their study. And then after that, we'll open the discussion and hear from our experts on the panel. So we will start with Zsolt Darvas and his co-authors, who will present the results on the recent research on the issue on integrating migrants in the European Union. And then we will go down the experts. We will start with Eva Degler, who is a policy analyst at the OECD. Then we will have Arjen Lerkes from the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, followed by Rainer Mutz, who is an advisor at the EPSC, the think tank of the European Commission. And last but certainly not least, Alessandra Venturini. Welcome back, Alessandra, to Bruegel, who is the Deputy Director of Migration Policy Center at the EUI in Florence. Thank you all for coming, and let me then immediately pass the floor to Zsolt. And Zsolt, you have about 20 minutes, and then we'll open the discussion.
Okay, so first of all, thank you all of you for coming here, being here. And we also would like to thank the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth for supporting this research. Now, the paper I will present today is a joint work with two of my colleagues, Urintia Batkistan, who is in Mongolia now, and Inés Goncalves Raposo, who is somewhere just next to here. But we had many other Bruegel colleagues who made a great contribution to this report, and I would like to thank their contribution for they made. And just let you know that we are uploading this report to our website as I'm speaking, so after the presentation you will be able to access it. Now, another point is that I prepared a relatively extensive presentation slide, not because I will be able to present all the slides in 20 minutes, but because we will also upload my presentation to the Bruegel website, and this presentation gives a more comprehensive view of the key topics than the time I will have to talk about in my 20 minutes. Let me start with a chart which probably many of us know about these demographic developments in the EU, but still when I first created and saw it, I was still surprised that there are really dramatic changes in demographics in the EU. I mean, this chart shows the change in population due to natural change, the balance of births and deaths, and net immigration. And in the early 60s, natural change was relatively large, 0.8% of population growth was due to that. And you can see it came down, and parallel to coming down the importance of natural change, net immigration became more and more important. And more recently, in 2015, there was the first year, at least since the Second World War, where there was an actual natural decline in EU population, while immigration, again, has increased primarily due to the large inflow of refugees. But this chart also has another message, namely if you compare net immigration in the early 2000s and now, then you can see that the magnitude of immigration as a share of domestic population is more or less similar. So the current magnitude of immigration is not unprecedented, but clearly what is unprecedented is the circumstances, because we have seen a very large inflow of asylum seekers to Europe from major conflict zones, and that created many problems, especially for these people, but also for the European Union. Now, so the report aims to assess the challenge, the migration challenge that Europe faces, and it focuses on 5 major issues. One is public perception, so what people think about immigration and the European policy response to that. The second one, we map and look at the scale of immigration into the EU. Then we look at the economic impact of immigration, that mostly based on a literature survey. And then two empirical work is the integration of migrants, and which has a special focus on financial integration, for which we conducted our own survey of financial institutions. And finally, we draw policy conclusions. So all of us know that immigration tops the challenges that people, European citizens, are mostly concerned about, along with terrorism. There is also some surveys which suggest that many people combine the two issues. So unfortunately, many people think that more immigration necessarily will mean more terrorist attacks throughout Europe. And you can also see in the chart that public is much less concerned about economic issues now than they were in 2011. Another important factor is if you take a global view and compare European perceptions about immigration to other regions of the world, then what we see that attitudes toward immigration in Europe is much more negative for immigration than in other parts. I mean, you can see, for example, that almost one half of European citizens wish to see a decline in immigration. An additional 36% of them would see unchanged, and only 8% of them would like to see further increase in immigration. But if you look at all other major regions, all of these numbers are much more in favor of somewhat higher immigration. So clearly, Europeans are much more anti-immigrant than other parts of the world. Another important aspect, this is based on an Ipsos survey, is that perceptions about immigration sometimes can be very wrong. Now, what this chart shows is that people were asked on what they think, what is the share of foreign-born people in their country. This is the red bar, and the orange bar on the right shows what is the actual share of foreign-born people in their country. And you can see that everywhere, not just in Europe, but everywhere, including in Japan and South Korea, people grossly overestimate the number of immigrants in their country. This can be both a consequence and also a cause for the generally negative attitudes toward immigration. Now, there are also a number of other interesting points on public perceptions, namely that people have relatively negative views on the way the European Union managed to address the current immigration and refugee crisis. Now, we don't really know what's the reason. Either they are related to real problems like in the shores of Greece and Italy, or a general more anti-immigration sentiment in other countries. But still the result is that people have generally disapproved the way the crisis was managed. But despite that, it's also interesting that people would see a more common European approach. I mean, more than 2/3 of population would like to see a common European asylum policy, and 90% of EU population, so almost everyone, would like to see increased efforts to fight illegal immigration. So it's a bit, I would say, contrary to the finding that they disapprove. But let me also show you something which is more positive about immigration. Again, an issue which I think has not that much featured in policy debates, is that the support for intra-EU immigration, in fact, has increased. I mean, the first time this question was asked was 2 years ago in May 2015. And you can see that in every half year when this question has been asked, the support, those who are very positive or fairly positive about immigration from other EU countries, has increased. And I think this is a very important message and shows that people still value mobility within the European Union. Let me say that this result applies to 27 of the 28 countries. The only country when there was not an increase was Romania. There was increase in all other countries, even in the United Kingdom, where, as we know, immigration from other EU countries was a major issue in the referendum preceding the Brexit referendum in June 2016. Now, let me skip a chart and come to the next topic, which is some numbers on and some facts about immigration in Europe. So, first of all, I mean, this chart shows for the EU 27, Bulgaria is missing due to data issues. 4 lines. Basically, what is the immigration-emigration of home country citizens and foreign country citizens? And what you can see is that 3 lines are more or less stable. There's only 1 line increase since 2009 and more recently up to 2015. Certainly that is the immigration of non-EU citizens, but all other lines remain broadly the same, which also implies that intra-EU mobility has not increased much recently. There was some increase, for example, from Italy and Spain and Greece. More people are now emigrating due to the adverse labor market conditions. But if you calculate, this is on the next chart, maybe it will be difficult to see. But if you look at the rate of emigration from Southern Europe, then what you see that even though it increased, so you should look at the right panel and the solid blue line. So you can see that emigration of home citizens indeed increased from Southern Europe, but it still remained below the average of the European Union. And overall, if you look at the number of other EU citizens residents or EU citizens resident in another EU country, you will still see relatively low levels in an international comparison. We have a big table in the report that I certainly didn't want to put you to this presentation, but I mentioned a few numbers here. Here I show the share of foreign citizens in the population of 11 Northwest European Union countries. I mean, these Northwest countries are, Germany, the UK, Sweden, Netherlands, and so on. And you can see that on average in these countries, less than 2% of the residents are citizens of Central and Eastern European countries. 0.15%, so it's a very, very small number, are posted workers from Central and Eastern Europe. So seeing this number, I'm a bit surprised that the so-called Posted Workers Directive revision receives such a great attention. There's also a bit more than 1% from Southern Europe and another 1% from other Northwest countries, for example, Belgians living in Germany and Germans living in Belgium. So altogether, if you add up all other EU citizens, they account for only 4.4% of total population of these Northwest countries, which I think a relatively small number, and certainly non-EU citizens add another 4%. We have a much more detailed analysis in the report, but certainly in my presentation I can't go into full details. So let me just highlight a very, very key concern. So I think the total volume is not that large, but still there are some concerns. And there are 2 really interrelated factors, brain drain and labor shortages. So brain drain typically refers to the emigration of high-skilled people from lower income to higher income countries. And indeed, if you look at the data, we find that 15% of Central European tertiary educated people are abroad. So I think that's a fairly large number. So 15 people are abroad. I mean, we see that, major shortages for doctors and so on in many countries in Central Europe. So that's an issue. But it's an issue not just for the highly qualified, but also this European Business Survey also suggests that also for the lower qualified people, labor shortages and emigration can be a major concern. So what you can see here is a chart showing labor shortages as a factor impeding business, coming from Business Survey. And you can see 3 groups here, Central European countries, the Northwest countries, and Southern European countries for industry and services. And what you can see here is that there was certainly before 2008, so before the crisis, there was an increase in labor shortages, especially in industry. Certainly with the crisis, it went down to close to 0. But since then, labor shortages in Central Europe reach record high levels. So there are clearly major factors, and a number of countries are suffering from there. And indeed, wages are rising, which may backfire after some point. So that's also a major problem that we would like to emphasize. And we also give some suggestions how could be not to remedy, but at least dampen this problem. But let me now turn to, if it will move, to immigration from outside the EU. Now, this chart shows in thousands of people who came from where and from what reasons. For example, you can see on the left panel that for relatively short-term migrants who come to Europe. Almost 500,000 people came from Ukraine last year, and almost all of them came to work. But on the right panel, you can see that those who come for or receive a residence permit for 1 year or longer, certainly the largest group is from Syria, and the largest share is the so-called other reasons, which are related to various humanitarian reasons. So clearly, all you know that inflow of asylum seekers and refugees was very important. But it's also important to look at, let's say, US people coming from US and China. For example, China, most of the people come to study here, while in the US, more than half come to study. Interesting, there are also some of these other reasons from the US. But clearly, the message is that people come from different countries for different purposes, and also for different durations, are very, very diverse. And if you compare it to what was the situation, let's say, 5 years ago, again, we see a completely different picture. So again, the composition of immigration from outside the EU has changed dramatically. And again, the big factor that all of us know is the huge inflow of asylum seekers. So this chart shows the first-time asylum applications in the EU. As you can see, in 2008 to 11, it was more or less stable around a bit more than 200,000 people per year. While in 15 and 16, it was more than 1.2 million. And in this year, if the current monthly average will continue, we could still see more than 600,000 asylum seekers, so well above the values of the previous years. So clearly this issue is there, and it will likely continue. And also, I mean, a very interesting feature is you look at the huge share of Germany, which is this red part on the bottom. Now, as many of you know, according to this so-called Dublin regulation, which regulates how asylum seekers should be dealt with, that has a so-called first point of entry rule. So the country in which the asylum seekers are first enter the EU should be responsible for dealing with the application. Now, clearly, Germany is not such a country, because I see not many people came from the Baltic Sea, but it clearly shows that there was a huge, basically, inflow through many countries that reached Germany in a massive scale. Now, how countries assess asylum applications? Here, what you see is that a share of positive first instant decisions in all countries, and for 3 years, 15, 16, and the first half of this year. And certainly all the countries are indicated, all EU countries are indicated, and certainly it's probably not easy to identify each country one by one. But if you just look at the chart, what is very clear that it's very much different. For example, many of you know that I'm Hungarian, and if you look at Hungary, Hungary accepts only about 15% of applications, very consistently in each year. By other countries, like Sweden, accepts many more. And again, there are large differences across countries. Now, one reason could be that the composition is so much different. It could be, for example, that Sweden, indeed, genuine refugees are arriving, while to Hungary, just economic migrants would like to use this big wave of refugee inflow to get into the EU. But I can't imagine that the composition of asylum seekers can be so much different to explain these large... Okay, so that's very good. I mean, a discussion is always good, but at least in my view, I can't imagine that the composition of asylum seekers could be so much different to explain, let's say, the difference between 15 and the 90% of acceptance rate. I think much more likely is that there are different implementation of EU asylum rules. Now, another issue is the very uneven distribution. I already showed the huge share of Germany, but clearly some countries are impacted much more. And I think that's an issue which the EU should address, which we'll probably discuss more in the next session. Now, what are the impact of immigration? So here we did a literature survey on 3 major aspects. One is on labor market, one is on fiscal, and one is more on general GDP. And certainly the big conclusion is that there is no conclusion. I mean, in a sense that there is no real conclusive evidence. I think there's one evidence that the statement which many people, I believe, think is that immigration takes jobs and depressed wages for natives, that's not well supported. Some studies find this result, studies find the opposite, and some studies find that it's more or less neutral. For example, you also had a study that we quote in which you find that within Italy, the presence of migrants or immigrants reduced intra-Italy mobility of north-south mobility of natives, which is certainly an adverse outcome. Also, there are some findings for the UK which suggest that competition from migrants may result in lower wages and lower employment, especially in a recession. But there are also many other studies which find the opposite. So the key conclusion is that it much more depends on the composition of labor. Certainly, when migrants are younger and better educated, they can bring more benefits than when they are older and less educated. Also, for the fiscal impact, basically, this is the same conclusion. Overall, the impact is probably not that big. So this welfare shopping issue, again, I think it's not well established in the literature, but again, there are many different papers. So I think the overall conclusion is that the composition of migrants matter a lot on what's the impact, and the same for output. And since my time is running, let me come to the issue of integration of immigrants. Now we look at many factors, and certainly I can only present a snapshot of that. One very important factor is integration to the labor market. So what is the share of working age population? People who are actually either working or unemployed but looking for work. And here, whenever it was possible, we differentiated between the native-born population, differentiated between third-generation migrants who were probably born abroad and immigrated to the country, and second-generation migrants who were born from migrant parents in the host country. Now, successful integration would suggest that the first generation of migrants do not much worse than the natives. I mean, certainly they just recently come, either a few years ago or even a decades ago, but certainly good integration would suggest that they are doing more or less similar to the natives. But for second-generation migrants who were born in the country of their residence, we would expect to do as well as the natives. I mean, I think that's a useful criterion for success. So again, what we compare here is the native-born second generation and the first generation, and we highlighted 4 countries, 2 which we regard more successful and 2 which we regard less successful. So if you look at Sweden and the UK, they are more successful. So you can indeed see that there are certainly some differences, but especially for Sweden, for example, the second generation migrants' labor market participation is 67%. It's just slightly below the native-born, 76 versus 79. But if you look at Italy and Belgium, the situation is really, really disappointing. I mean, overall, even the native-born has a lower participation rates here than let's say, in UK and Sweden. But especially second-generation migrants doing even worse than first-generation migrants. So people emigrate to these countries. Some of them come to work, so they have a somewhat lower activity than in fact, in Italy, even higher activity than natives. But their children have a very, very low activity. Look at in Italy, it's 48%, so only half of okay, so she disagrees, which is very good for a debate. But at least the data we were able to collect shows that second-generation migrants has a much lower labor market activity than native-born and even first-generation migrants. Okay, so time is running. So let me mention maybe a few facts and just skip the charts. Another important factor is certainly what is the educational composition of migrants, and certainly we see that non-EU born have generally a lower level of education level, which again can explain that they are less integrated. Another important aspect is, for example, school dropout rates, so the share of children who do not complete. And what we find that with the sole exception of the United Kingdom, in all other countries, non-EU country born, so immigrants with a non-EU background, they have a much higher school dropout rates than the natives, which again I think is a very disappointing result, because school should have the primary role in fostering integration. There are a lot of research showing that, you know, education, especially primary education and early childhood education, are really, really crucial. So the large school dropout rates are really disappointing. We also look at PISA scores, and again, with the exception of a few countries, we do find that second-generation migrants have much weaker PISA scores than the natives or even first-generation migrants. So overall, what we, in terms of integration, our results are relatively mixed. So there are few countries, mostly the UK and Sweden, which have relatively good outcomes. But in many, many other European Union countries, unfortunately, integration doesn't seem to work well. Now, a special chapter is the financial inclusion of refugees. And as I said, I will not show you any chart, but I invite you to look at my presentation, which will be uploaded. But basically, we conducted a survey and found that certainly financial regulation, which has clearly the valid aim of preventing money laundering and terrorist financing, on the one hand, certainly they are tightening regulations to reach these very valid goals. But on the other hand, it made much more difficult for financial institutions to integrate and offer financial services to asylum seekers and refugees. And we have many, many other interesting findings. And that would lead me to policy conclusions, which I will not have the time to discuss. But let me mention just one big message that I would like to deliver, is that we call for a much better identification system of asylum seekers and refugees. We think that the creation of a European identity document for asylum seekers would be much worthwhile to consider. By the way, there is no European document for orderly EU citizens, so it will be strange to have a European document for non-EU citizens. But still, I think since this problem is so severe, I think creation of a European document linked to a pan-European registry of asylum seekers and refugees would be very, very helpful for their identification and could also limit a lot abuses. We have altogether 12 policy recommendations. This is only one. I don't have time to present it, but certainly some of my colleagues here, and especially in the next panel, would primarily deal with policy issues. So yeah, I hope we will be able to have the chance to discuss these issues in the second panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zsolt, for a very comprehensive study and some of the interesting insights, lots of graphs. I certainly invite you all to have a look at the report and all the analysis that Zsolt has not presented here today. There's lots to talk about. I hear some disagreements, but let me then immediately start that. But can I turn first to you, Eva, and if you can give us your take on some of these results or even your own results from the research. Please. Actually, we need the mic because I think we are live streamed as well.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, then I'll use the mic.
Yeah, please.
And there is a presentation.
Yeah, can we have the presentation on as well, please?
Yes. And the clicker. Okay, let's see when it comes up.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, well, so thank you so much for inviting me. This is a really interesting report. It's really a sort of tour de force around everything migration and integration related, so that's a really ambitious project. I'll be zooming in a little bit more on the work we're doing at the OECD, particularly looking at integrating refugees into the labor market, and sort of trying to focus on what sort of policies we've seen through our country reviews we've been doing, but also more through comparative work we're doing, what sort of policies actually seem to work or seem to be promising. I'll be focusing on a couple of OECD countries, but specifically on Germany, because this is also what I've worked on. Because the question about how to do this in the end is also really a question of how to speed up the process. So if we look at data from before the humanitarian crisis, this is from 2014, we actually see that in the past it has taken quite a bit of time. So if you look at the green line, which is refugees and also family migrants, the red line, you see that it takes, on average, up to 15 years until refugees in the past have reached employment levels that are comparative to the native-born population. So the question we really pose ourselves is, okay, how can this process be speed up? This is also what our member countries are asking us. And I'm going to highlight 4 different policy areas that were also part of the report, actually, that seem to be rather promising to facilitate this process. The first area, and we see a lot of OECD countries moving in that direction, is to offer integration support that is increasingly tailored towards the individual concerned. That sounds, in terms of policy recommendations, like a very straightforward recommendation to make. In practice, this is pretty difficult to implement. And maybe as an illustration, we can look here at the educational background of asylum seekers that came to Germany in 2015 and 2016. And if you look at the bottom two rows, you see that they're well represented in pretty much every educational background category. Interestingly, not that much has changed in that composition between 2015 and 2016. But when you look at the different origin countries, you can see there are massive differences. It's actually not surprising that refugees are an extremely heterogeneous group, ranging from people who have university education to having no formal schooling whatsoever, and this for governments has really been a challenge. If you take, for example, language learning, language courses, if you put into this class someone who is illiterate with someone who has a university degree and actually might be fluent in English, this is not a very effective approach to language learning and frustrating for everyone involved. So we've seen, for example, in Germany, who in 2016 started adapting their language courses, trying to tailor it a bit more to individual needs, offering, for example, specific courses for highly skilled migrants, offering specific courses for illiterate migrants. But in practice, this is relatively difficult to implement because you need to find the qualified teachers in the first place, while there's a really large number of people who are in need of language support. Another policy area is increasingly important and has been acknowledged by a lot of OECD countries in the past, Sweden, for instance, Germany as well, that shows that they're trying to do to get refugees into integration measures much earlier in the past. So this idea of really making sure that there's early access to integration measures, because, and research backs this up quite a bit, is that there is a lasting positive impact on the labor market integration on. If we look, for example, on employment rates of refugees against this data from 2014, we see that language skills do give a massive boost to employment. So here you see at the left corner people who indicate that their language level is that of a beginner or less, and then the employment rates for someone who has an intermediate skill level, and that is only B1, are actually quite important. So when it comes to language learning and early access, this is really something that does help the process along. Another policy area, and this has been somewhat of a blind spot and also highlighted in the report, is that we actually don't really know that much about employers at all. How they experience the process, what sort of obstacles they encounter when they're trying to hire refugees, what sort of obstacles they encounter while refugees are in employment. And in a review we did for Germany last year, we actually did a survey among German employers, which is not representative of the average German employer, but still it's a sample size of a good 2,000 employers, many of them actually having had experiences in hiring refugees. Around 60% of them said they had received applications, and then of those people, another 2/3, a bit more, actually hired them either for jobs or for internships or apprenticeships. And among these people who do have this experience, we asked them, why did you actually do this? And you see that social responsibility is one of the overwhelming important reason for doing so. There are other motivations that play into this. For example, securing labor supply, thinking that asylum seekers or refugees might have complementary skills, for example, when it comes to language skills. The idea that there's labor market shortages, we thought that might be an issue. It turns out actually not that many employers, at least in our sample, said they had difficulties in finding other suitable candidates. So social responsibility in Germany, at least, has been a main motivation for employers. And the optimist would say, okay, that's great. You actually see their employers, and that's a laudable approach to this, who want to take social responsibility and integrate people into the labor force. The pessimist might maybe say, okay, but is that enough in the long run? And what happens to those people who are actually not convinced? Like, it seems there is not enough of a business case to actually hire asylum seekers or refugees. And indeed, other results of that survey, but also through consultation rounds we have done with the UNHCR and employers in different areas of the OECD, there are considerable obstacles to employers. One of them being the language skills of refugees not being necessarily high enough, but also many employers reported that the bureaucratic structures are quite difficult for them to maneuver, that often there is a very complex legal framework that has evolved around hiring refugees and asylum seekers in particular, and that they don't really know where they can get support, either to maneuver these sort of bureaucratic structures, but also in terms of support they could, for example, get from public employment services. So there's definitely, in many countries, still a lot to do. And a point could be made for engaging employers more systematically, also in policy making, and make sure they get the sort of support measures they would need to help refugees integrate and give them sustainable and lasting employment. And to keep this rather short, because I guess we're sort of pressed for time already, the last point I would like to make actually brings me back to the first slide. There are some key elements that seem to contribute to speeding up this process. And I don't think we should take it as a given, seeing that in the past it took 15 to 19 years on average until employment rates reached a similar level, that this has to be the case as of now. Countries have actually done quite a bit to improve their integration system, particularly countries such as Germany and Sweden, for example, in reaction to the humanitarian crisis. But while it's possible to speed up this process, I think the really crucial question here is, what is a realistic time frame? And that is sort of an unanswerable question. I guess we'll have to see what happens in the next couple of years. But at the same time, it is important to see labor market integration as an investment from a country perspective. And particularly for those who are very low skilled, for women with children, for people who, for example, in their origin countries already were inactive, this is going to take a while. And it's not going to have an immediate payoff. So having this sort of long-term perspective and knowing that this will take a couple of years is really crucial to make sure that the potential of these people that they have does not go unused in the following decades. That would be it from my side. There are, of course, a lot of other really interesting topics. The issue of dispersal policies, housing policies is really interesting when it comes to refugee integration, local labor market conditions, but maybe that will come up during the discussion.
Indeed, thank you very much for your very interesting results, and very encouraging results, actually, in some ways. I mean, you know, given the size of the problem, the social responsibility aspect, the answer is really quite impressive, actually, and very interesting to see. Let me turn to Arjan, a Dutch perspective. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Did you have some slides?
No, I don't. No, I'll speak just like this. So I was asked to reflect on the report, especially also the executive summary. The report arrived a little bit late, so my comments are mostly based on the executive summary and the presentation today. I think it's a very interesting and important project. Of course, we've seen these demographic changes. And there's clearly a tension also on the one hand, the labor market needs in Europe, and also the rights, human rights that we wish to protect on the one hand, and on the other hand, of course, the cultural conservatism that we see in Europe, and xenophobia even. And it's to some extent an old problem, but I think the tension has increased for a number of reasons after 9/11, the economic crisis, refugee crisis. So I think it's very important to see, okay, how is Europe ready to deal with that tension in the future, also knowing that we can predict further increases in migration. I don't think we are. So this report, I think, is a very important. When I read it, though, I had some issues maybe with the general message, which seems to be that overall the economic effects of migrations are quite not very negative. Maybe in the presentation it was more differentiated, but in especially in the executive summary it was quite optimistic in the sense that the economic effects are positive, or at least not very negative, and people overestimate the number of immigrants, and they may have negative attitudes. So if only we can convince the population that the economic effects are good, and if we tell them that there are not so many immigrants, then everything will be solved. And even though I think that's part of the solution, I think it's a little bit the picture is a little bit more complicated. One thing is that the economic effects are, I think, more differentiated. It depends also on the type of migrants that you receive. Also, a lot of studies, to the extent that we have them, are based on the U.S. with with different welfare system, with fewer refugees, also different outgroups, more the African Americans rather than the immigrants. So I think it's very difficult for us to really know. And there are also some evidence that, especially low-skilled native workers, that they do face negative effects in terms of maybe their wages, but also the need for them to adapt and find other work. Maybe there will be new work because of more economic activities, but some of them need to adapt. So I think there are two things there. There's also, it may be negative, also economically for some groups. They need to adjust, and this also causes stress for them. And that's also something that needs to be taken into account. And of course, there are also many non-economic aspects that explain the resistance to migration. I think we also, if we want to solve these issues in the future, we need to also tackle these issues. And they are maybe related to phenomena that economists do not typically study so much, but more like sociologists or social psychologists, and have to do with status anxiety of groups, different changes in status hierarchies, boundary maintenance, all kinds of things that I think are also very important and need to be addressed. Third thing that I noticed is that even though I think it's very strong for this report, that it gives a kind of a European overview, what I did find a little bit lacking was a more global perspective, or like maybe also a look on what is happening in Africa, like in source countries, and because my view is that their view will also, and the developments there will also be very important in what's going to happen in the future, and also will be very important to, if the topic of migration control, for example, is also mentioned. You cannot talk about migration control without also including the perspective, I think, of source countries. And okay, so having said that, I think it is true that we can convince more people that there are also economic benefits, and that people may have some prejudice. Let me try to add some other recommendations, which I think could be done. And it should be emphasized that there is no. This is a very politicized field. There are no easy fixes. Some solutions will always be also contested. But I think one of the things that we can do is to make Europe also more ready for immigration. And this is already happening, for example, by improving the English language proficiency of the native born. And we're already seeing that younger generations, for example, are already better able to adapt to this more global reality. So that's one thing. I also think we need to invest much more on non-verbal communication skills of the native born. So we could invest much more in cultural sensitivity trainings or cultural intelligence in schools, in our police forces, in all institutions basically that we have. Because I think a lot of issues are also related to these non-verbal issues. So I think that's maybe something that we can agree on. Most people could agree on, but there will also be maybe some more controversial measures that could be taken. One is, of course, a better selection of migrants, which is possible maybe for labor migrants because you have more freedom to select. Maybe we should also select migrants who speak language, already speak the language, a European language like English. I think that hasn't been done in the past with guest worker programs, for example. And maybe be more strict in who we allow for family migration, and maybe also for asylum system. Right? That's also maybe a very controversial system, but I think it will surely be on the table in the next year. Also, maybe with a offshore processing, and maybe more resettlement programs, and maybe some selection there also. But I think that's also something, because I do think that these things will also increase the acceptance of legal migration by the population. If you select migrants, and also if you have a more predictable stream of migrants. Maybe these are controversial things. I'm not necessarily saying that I advocate them, but I do think they will be on the table. And finally, there are also one of the things that is on the table, I think already, is maybe a more differentiating social rights for citizens and non-citizens. There has been a tendency in Europe for a long time to sort of believe that non-citizens should have the same social rights, such as refugees, but you also see that maybe there's, if you differentiate rights and give immigrants gradual access to the welfare state, that could also be a way to allow for more migration and to increase acceptance. Okay, that is. Then finally, I have some words about migration control, because there's also this a little bit of the assumption that if only can keep the illegal immigrants out. And one of the things that also needs to be emphasized, that we'll never be able to do that completely, and that's also a good thing. Because I've done quite some research on migration control, and if you at some point increase the migration enforcement also become kind of counterproductive and create perverse effects. So, and we need to also explain, I think, the population that we never have full migration enforcement. That's one thing. And the other thing, I think, that could be elaborated, okay, how are we going to improve migration control? And what you find is that especially politicians, they tend to emphasize like strict measures and a lot of tough language. Whereas if you look at how migration control actually operates in practice, you need much more also soft power in the sense of acceptance by countries of origin, acceptance by migrants, that they should return, for example, to their country of origin. I think much more can be done in that field to increase also the soft power, the perceived legitimacy of our migration control measures. And one of the things that needs to be done, and then I come back to where I started, is that we need to, I think, to develop genuine partnerships with countries of origin and transit, and not just kind of quick deals, but a genuine long-term efforts to mutually improve development. Yeah, Africans would be, yes.
The African Summit in...
yes.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much, I think that was increasing the scope of the way that we need to look at the problem. I think that's actually your main message here, and I think that's, of course, an important, even if we focus here on just the one thing, the solutions to the problem are broader than that. So thank you for bringing that up. But let me turn to Rainer. Rainer, you've worked a lot on these issues. Can you tell us your views on some of the results and the discussion here, and indeed some of the blind spots on the issues?
Sure. So when I got the invitation about, 2 weeks ago to sit on the panel here, I started taking notes, what should I say? Then about 3 days ago, I got the summary of the report, and I decided to throw all my preparations away because all the boxes, everything I would have liked to say was already in the short version. And then around midnight, I got a report, and then I was throwing away the rest of my preparation and decided I have to say something else because everything I would have to say already Zsolt has said. So I would laud the approach in saying, yes, you're ticking all the right boxes, but maybe there are other boxes that could be ticked, and I think Arjen and Eva have alluded to that. The reason why we are sitting here is just the people arriving via the Mediterranean. Yeah, let's be honest, if this would not be the case, we would have no interest in migration other than we had 3, 5, or 10 years ago when only a few people were interested in them, a few sitting here on the panel, but we had no audience, right? So this is the trigger, yeah? And the problem with the trigger is that we are seeing the trigger through the lens of 2015-16 and not through a 2017 lens. So we see the people coming from Africa, and then we tend to think in two ways. On the one side, because the people coming 2015-16, literally walking from Istanbul to Vienna, Berlin, and Stockholm as refugees, we tend to think that the people coming across the Mediterranean are also refugees. And I think that's also a weak point in the report, in the sense that you have a loose way of addressing the issue, putting all the people arriving that way in a humanitarian category, and I think that at least there it could be sharpened a little bit. Yeah. The other way is that saying, oh my God, the Africans are also going to walk across the Mediterranean like Jesus, probably walking over the sea like Jesus in the Bible, and going to come as well. But that's not the case. We are complaining about irregular Africans coming to Italy, but we are bringing these people to Europe. This is the overlooked missing link. Yeah, the smugglers are, yes, maybe in Libya or something like that, but the main smuggling organization is the European Border and Coast Guards. Yeah, they pick up people in the Mediterranean and they bring them to Italy. Yeah, or increasingly also to Spain. It's only over the Aegean that there is no European coast guards or smugglers involved, because there the people still come on their own boats. Yeah? So we have a kind of an ambivalent approach, on the one side driven by humanitarian considerations, but on the other hand we are complaining about the results of our own humanitarian considerations to a degree. So there's an ambivalence approach here. Yeah? Let's be honest about that. Because if you think that's illegal migration, which Frontex has it on its homepage, the question is, where is the illegal immigration taking place? Yeah? Is the boarding of the European Coast Guard ship illegal? Yeah, then the captains of these ships should at least go to court, maybe even to jail. Is the disembarkation in Italy at a designated port of exit or entry in, I don't know, in Trapani or in wherever it happens, is this illegal? Yeah, then who is responsible for that illegality? So it's you're losing the notion of illegality. I think Frontex is applying it in the wrong way, but still the perception is that this is not okay what's happening. At the same time, we are doing it. Then there's a data trap that I would like to mention. It's very important to see that data on irregular arrivals at sea in the Mediterranean are available as of yesterday. So we have a daily update on that. And this creates a kind of a hyperventilation both among politicians and among media, traditional media, but also social media. We tend to look at things that where data are readily available. There's also other immigration happening, but we only know about it with a time lag of maybe 18 months when the data get published. Yeah? And so we tend to look at things that are readily available more than maybe at the major things that are happening. So let me just take you to two blind spots I'm seeing. The one blind spot, and that's somehow missing in the report, is that there is a third category. We just do not only have refugees, asylum seekers, refugees, and regular migrants. There is also people coming. We issue 16 million Schengen visa. We have 700 million crossings of borders across external Schengen borders every year, including visa-free travel from Moldovans, from Ukrainians, from Serbia, from the visa-free part of the world. If only 1% of them stays, it adds, I don't know, 500,000 irregular migrants to the EU population. And so there is two categories of people. On the one side, asylum seekers that are unsuccessful with their claim, but are not taken back by their home countries. And on the other hand, people coming as travelers or with short-term visa, as you have shown in one of the graphs, but overstaying the conditions. And there is a category of people here. And here, I think when talking about the root causes, let's be honest, we are the root cause of migration, of this type of migration. Have you ever refused to buy food because you thought it's too cheap? Happens rarely, yeah? Have you ever made sure that the nannies of your children, are covered by Social Security, that they can retire, in 20 or 30 years from now? Are you sure about the legal status of the people taking care of your parents? Are you really sure? Have you ever paid taxes for the cleaning ladies working at home? And so if you can tick all the 4 boxes, then you are not part of the root causes of migration. But many of us are the root cause of migration because we are creating a demand for irregular or illegal employment and irregular migrants. Yeah, let's be sure about that. And it's maybe larger in the US than it is in Europe, but it exists in Europe also to a large extent. Yeah, so that's a kind of a blind spot. Why is it not addressed? It's only addressed in construction or other areas where there is a competition with the domestic workforce, unionized domestic workforce. But as long as the people getting exploited are non-voting foreigners, and as long as the people reaping the benefit of having the purchasing power of their salaries augmented and voting people, we rarely, address the issue here. And the other issue is that, I mean, if even people working on migration, if you would be asked how many people are arriving in a legal manner to Europe, now Zsolt has shown the graph, and so it makes no sense to ask you, but people usually don't think that we have 2 million legal migrants coming to Europe every year, because we're so much focusing on the irregular migrants that we tend to overlook the composition and people coming in a regular way. And I would support what Arjen has said, with family reunion being the most important reason, and in years like 2015-16, then humanitarian considerations, people entering via the asylum, we might come to the conclusion that we might not be getting the right migrants. Yeah? So when you look at the skills and compare low-level and low-skilled and high-skilled migrants, you see that Europe is getting about 50% of the low-skilled migrants getting into OECD countries, but it's only getting, if you include the 1% to the CE countries, so 31% of the high-skilled, as compared to the US getting the lion's share, and Canada. Yeah? And that's partly of a selection effect via immigration policies, but it's also partly due to the attractiveness. Yeah? How come Central and Eastern Europe is 10% of the EU population, 5% of the EU GDP, but only a small fraction of highly skilled people wanting to move there. So there's also an attractiveness issue that we are having, but that's true for Europe as a whole. We have shown that there's problems with integration. This is the graph that Eva has just shown. I had also prepared it because I thought that's missing in the report, showing this time lag, because there clearly is a gate of entry gap. Yeah? And as now 50% of the migrants coming legally or in an irregular manner, but then getting regularized via an asylum procedure, need 15 to 20 years to get to the same activity rate that people, either natives or people recruited as migrant labor in the first place, we really have an issue that needs to be addressed, and that might reverse the otherwise benign calculations about how beneficial migration is to the public coffer and to the economy and society overall. So I think the migration wave that we have seen over the last 3-4 years, and also the growth of family reunion over recruitment of workers, should give a second thought about our judgment here. And yes, it can be overcome. Yeah, so I mean, Eva has shown that there is instruments on the table and good practices to follow, but we should at least reconsider the way we are recruiting people and the way we are admitting people. So it's not just about reskilling those who don't come with enough linguistic and other skills in order to bring them to the labor force. We should also pay more attention in making sure that those who are coming are already bringing the skills along. Yeah? You can have linguistic training before you arrive, and not after you come. You can have your credentials, your documents being recognized before you come. I mean, that's something that administratively could be done. That's possible. Yeah. I wanted to show that slide that Zsolt has also shown as a final statement here, saying, and that's mentioned in the report, that since the year 1992, migration is more important as a driver of demographic change than fertility and mortality. There's also an indirect effect, as the people coming are usually in the age bracket 18 to 35, and they rather tend to have their children over here than have them born where they come from, staying with their grandparents. There's also fertility, the fact that fertility is still, I mean, at a considerable level in Europe, despite the fact that we're only having 1.5 children per family on average, also has to do with the age composition of the immigrant. What is, in my view, more important to understand migration in Europe is the following. And that's the year 1985, when for the first time in modern history, you can say from that onwards, there's more immigration than emigration. Because let's not forget, Europe is the most important continent of emigration. We have populated the world. We're looking back to 400 years of emigration since the age of discoveries. And we are only looking back at 30 years of net immigration since the mid-80s. And we must understand that our own mindsets still are more dominated by the 400 years of emigration than by the 30 years of immigration. And each of us, we can do the test. We think migration is good. but it's us going other places. We think we have the right to live elsewhere. Even the anti-migrant people in Hungary or in I don't know, in Bulgaria or even in Germany or in Austria think if they are going somewhere else or if their children can make it elsewhere, that's perfect. It's just not, other people should not allow to come. Yeah. So if Arnold Schwarzenegger becomes governor of California, half of Austria is cheering. Yeah. Having a successful Kosovo-Albanian bodybuilder who turned entrepreneur, becoming the president of Austria or the governor of Styria, inconceivable. Yeah. So you have that. Yeah. Dilma Rousseff becoming the president of Bulgaria. Cheers in Bulgaria. She's now more popular in Bulgaria than back in Brazil. Having an Amazon Indian becoming president of Bulgaria, no way. Yeah? And so I think that with the test, you can say we are still in this emigration mode when it comes to institutions, mindsets, things like that. A general approach. I mean, you cannot change mindsets, but at least we should recognize that it is the case. Yeah, and so let's not forget about that. Thanks, Abba.
Talking about big blind spots. Thank you very much. And Alessandra, let me give you the floor immediately because we are short of time. And the clicker, yes. Yeah.
So
thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It was very nice.
You have slides, right? Yeah.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It was very nice to read all the presentation, all the report very rapidly, however. And I will make some comment and I will use some of as Ryan, I prepared a presentation, but I'm less efficient than him, so I wasn't able to revise everything, so I will be less coherent. Okay, the first point that Ryan already mentioned, but I would like to stress even more, and I was very surprised that you used, they say there are many migrants arriving now. Many, and you supported this idea that is in the common public opinion that we are invaded by migrants. Let us take the case of Italy. In Italy, migration started in the 90s. Before, we didn't have anyone, only a few British, 2 Americans, 1 German, and that's all. Very rich, by the way, in the 90s. In 2015, we have 5 million of foreigners. That means, if you make a calculation, very back on the envelope, we have 200,000 people entering each year. Now, how many, and this was, okay, a shock for Italy. We were unable to manage the policy. We had 7 legalization. That means the back door was used more than the front door. We were slow in adjusting. But now, how many people arrive by boat in Lampedusa and this? 170,000 people. And only half of them apply for asylum seeker in Italy. So the number is small, but the Italians perceive that they are invaded because they see the boat all the time and so on. So I will be very careful with the introduction of the report. And Raina, in other occasions, mentioned even more strongly. There are not many. You are very right in saying that this is a phenomenon different from an organized phenomenon, so, and different from illegal migration, because we are very clever in Italy with the back door. We legalize them, and they are trained by the community of arrival in their own business area, because we don't know that they're there. Now, instead, the ones that apply are in the hand of the administrative institution of the country, the prefect, all the legal association, the sparse system, and so on. And Italy has shown for labor migration that takes time to adjust. Now we are much more efficient. So the number is not relevant per se, it's the channel through which it's come. If they are family member, why we don't speak any time of family member? They are 50% of the inflow. Have you ever heard? Even my students don't want to write article on family member because they're not popular. It seems that it's not an issue. Okay, so this is my first point. The second point that I want to stress is public opinion. don't take so for granted the public opinion view of the Eurobarometer, Eurosurvey, World Value Survey. There is this famous article of Tim Hutton that distinguished, which is an economist, not a political scientist, so something that we like more because it's solid. It's solid, it's speaking with words that we economists understand. And in fact, I was very much convinced because social science used other way. So he distinguished, using the European values of the world, between preferences and salience. It is important. You see, I am against migrants, but I don't care. You see, the salience and the preference are very different, and especially the two react very different to economic variables. So when we speak about preferences and we forget to weigh it by the salience, probably we overemphasize something which is people that are against but they don't take into account. And in fact, also the work that the MPC has now, and the MPC has a new project with Andrew Geddes and James Dennis on OPAM, on public opinion, survey on public opinion on migration. What they show that the position and the vote on against or in favor of migration is very traditional, conservative and progressive. So there is not such a big effect on media, public opinion, and so on. It's not my work, so you can trust them, I think. But I will be a little bit more critical on this. The second thing that I was, when you were suggesting before, I was suggesting before, okay, they were suggesting before that, no, the graph doesn't fit what you are, but that the asylum policy is implemented in a different way in each country. And I told you before that I was not in favor of this. And I would stress more the quality of asylum are very different. And in your figure, you show that in Italy only 40% were accepted and 60% were not accepted. Remember that, I'm not defending Italy, sorry, but remember, but I know the case very well. Remember that we have three types. We try to accept all the people that there is any chance to enter. Asylum seeker, refugees, 10%. Subsidiary protection, and the last one is humanitarian. We were enabled to accept more than 40% because the others do not have the condition. None of them is Syrian. We have also a resettlement program from Lebanon of Syrian in the camp in Lebanon. For 2,000 people, we were enabled to resettle directly through the High Commission for Refugees, the people that we apply all the practice, because at the last minute, they want to go to Germany and Sweden. So I will be not so strong in saying that this is a different implementation of the asylum policy. It's different quality of asylum. In Germany, 40% of the asylum seekers are Syrian, and they receive immediate nationality. So I will be more nuanced because the story is more complex. Anyhow, I think it's always difficult in Europe to have the same policy for all the country. This idea of best practice, exporting best practice, if you look at these two graphs, this is the employment, the differential between migrants and native, male and female, in Europe. And you see that the color are very different among them. If you go, I should point that, if you go at the regional level instead, the color are less different. So there is a large distinction between national structure and regional structure. And there is this very famous, very well-known article of Martin Guzzi, Martin Kanek, and Kurekova that explain very clearly that 87% of the wage differential is explained by different regulation, different institution, different productive system, different type of welfare, but different vocational training. So it's very difficult. The policy implication of this is that it's very difficult to export a good practice from one country to the other. There is too much faith in this. Going on of integration, I liked very much the survey that you made. I would like just to reinforce, my slide, the last that I want to show you is at the end, so don't worry, don't look. Is exactly on linguistic distance. This is a work done on Italy because Italy is very little studied, so I am the expert on the country. And what you see is the wage profile of natives. The other one is the wage profile of the migrant from the south, because we have internal migrants. And the other one is the wage profile of migrant by linguistic distance. Maximum linguistic distance, the brown one. Blue linguistic distance, the other one. So the linguistic distance, they never achieve the native wage profile, but the linguistic distance matter. And why they never achieve? Because there is a strong segmentation in the labor market. If you take the first quartile of the income distribution wage, that's mean the poorest job, and you take the jobs, the sector, the very detailed sector, 4-digit sector, what you have this, the natives are there, and here you have all the foreigners. 70% of the foreigners are in this type of sector. Also, the native that enter in this type of sector, we remain there for the life. The profile is the same. So the segmentation is very important in the labor market. So when you say that migrants should be, especially asylum seekers, should be inserted in the labor market as soon as you can, this is very crucial, because if they have a low to exit from this type of sector, the probability of exit from this type of sector is function of the linguistic ability. Language is the only way out of this. So what I would suggest, reinforcing what you have been said before, is exactly linguistic ability is very important. You cannot invest a lot before entering the labor market. You can do this. The traditional educational linguistic policy are of this type. You provide them linguistic course in the country of origin. You can provide them the linguistic course in the country of destination. No, we have to revise the linguistic policy, create a long life learning, try to insert them in the labor market, and update the linguistic knowledge. You cannot keep them separate from the labor market. It's better to introduce them in the labor market, but have a day a week, 2 days a month, something like that. So we need to revise our educational and linguistic policy. And just to contribute. We worked a lot on this in the MPC and the Medan. We want to understand also this is on diversities, the role of the community, because the other important driver for not exit from the segregation area, is the size of the community. This is already in Italy. You have 2 dimensions, the linguistic distance on the horizontal side and the size of the community on the vertical one. You understand immediately that it's not only the size, the story of the ethnic enclave, no? You create a larger community, and this is very important if you want to redistribute asylum seekers around the country, how you want to put them. In Italy, we have this distribution, and when we did the analysis, what we found that, of course, for Romania, even if they are the largest community, the effect on the wage of the migrant is positive. It's not negative. It's not the size of the community that's matter, but the linguistic distance of the community. And for Germany, the story is different, because as you see, in Germany, the concentration is on the right side. There is not a large community on the left side with the linguistic distance, so on. And here I put some result because I know that the economists like this, but this is what we show. Here is the linguistic distance, that is driving the negative effect on wage. In Germany, the effect is similar but less strong because they have. So the other thing that we are, so the policy should not be against agglomeration clustering per se. They should be taking into account the linguistic distance of the community. So it's useless to fight the agglomeration of Romanian in the country, and should invest in linguistic ability of the migrant, but not only of the worker, because we always care only of the worker. We care only about the worker. So all the results usually in the research are for the employer. No, we should care also about the wife, the children that are there, the community. So the linguistic policy that already was advised should be revised. And we also work on diversity at province level in Italy and in Germany, and you find that the share of migrants, the clear line is where there are more migrants, of course, is very important. The ethnic diversity, which is on the right side instead, is not similar, but in Germany is very important. In the east part, there are very few migrants, but the diversity is very large. So what we find when we put this variable into the regression, that in Italy, the share of migrants is negative. Has a negative effect on the wage of natives, a positive on the one, a wage of foreigner, a positive on the one of natives. Why? There is segmentation. The migrant, as I showed you before, they're all in a segmented labor market. So the more migrants there are, the more segmented is the economy, the more they have a low wage. For the natives, instead, no, they are complement. When you put diversity, we find that is positive for the natives. This is a standard result for Germany. Akai has found this. And we found also a positive result for the migrant if they have a similar nationality to the destination country. But this is just to show that if we want to have policies, we have to be they should be very tailored to the reality. We cannot try to sell a policy for all. A last comment. Sorry, I strongly appreciate the chapter 6 on financial inclusion of refugees. Very much, because there is very little on this in general. The research is, and you didn't mention, however, nothing on financial literacy, because you can have financial inclusion if you have financial literacy. And I'm working with Intesa San Paolo on a project exactly on financial education for migrants, not only for asylum seeker, but also in general for migrants. I think this is something which is really not explored enough, on which financial inclusion in a broad sense, not just teaching them how to open an account, but how to use the money during the week, during the months, how to save money. And I think the two parts could go together, because these are really something in which there is very little attention. Thank you very much.
I think that's a lot of different things, actually. Zsolt, I'd like to give you an opportunity to react to some of these, but do you mind if, because we don't have all that much time, if you open the floor for questions, and then you can pick some comments along the way. Okay, so let's do that. I invite you all to ask questions to Zsolt, or indeed to our panel. Please, 2 questions here. Yeah, could we have the mic, please? There's the lady here at the front.
Hello, my name is Jarka Chlopkova, and I have a clarification question on Zsolt. On your graph, when you were talking about the labor market, and you had 4 countries, and the last one was Italy, and I want to understand how you explain the discrepancy or the difference, why the second generation migrants have worse labor integration than the first integration migrants? Just a clarification. What's your hypothesis? Why is this taking place? Thank you.
It's me. Oh, I see. Okay. Okay. Hello, I'm Professor Linson from the IMNRC. Yes, when Alessandra Venturini, I completely agree there's a need for a fundamental education revolution. I'm wondering, or rather, I'm questioning the competence of the EU institutions and United Nations institutions to deal with the complexities of the challenges we are faced with today. There is a need, indeed, for a fundamental mindset, educational governance revolution, and for this you need necessarily a new global governance infrastructure. Thank you.
A question here at the front?
Okay. Luis Martinez Arevalo from Actualidad Económica. Just a comment or a question to Alessandra. I found it very interesting that you dealt with the linguistic distance, let's say. And I'm wondering if you have studied the case of Spain, because here we have we have had a lot of immigration in the last years, but we have these two very distinct groups, people who speak Spanish and hence should not have great problems in integrating, and people who speak other languages who should have. So that's my comment. And to Hagen, yes, I agree entirely with the comments you've made, in the sense that there should be longer-term planning, preparing our institutions for the entrance of migrants, agreements with foreign countries as a whole. But the fact is that the numbers which were shown here show that much of this immigration is due to, let's say, chance, right? The fact that there's a war in Syria has been the cause of a great wave of immigrants in the last few years. So there are things which you just can't foresee. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Let's take that question from Guntram and then come back to the panel.
Yeah, I wanted to push Rainer a little bit on two of his points. I mean, one was the moral dilemma that you described, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit more sort of what's the thinking also in the EU institutions. I mean, also on this matter. I mean, I think there's more and more attempts to make sure that the boat people that are being picked up basically go directly back to Libya, and perhaps you can say a little bit about how does this look empirically at the moment. I mean, and you know, what's also the kind of thinking that the EU institutions have on this. Now, the second point I wanted to push you on is, I think, this point on high-skill immigration. You know, how can we get better at attracting talent globally? I think the gap is well known, but what do we do about it? What should the EU institutions do about it, and what should the national institutions do about it?
Thank you, Guntram. Well, okay, let's go back. Zsolt, do you mind taking questions, and then we'll come back to the panel? Any comments on what you've heard so far?
Yes. Let me start with a few comments that my colleagues said. And certainly one very important issue is that you mentioned, Ariane, the possibility of controls. So in our paper, we intentionally did not say a view whether there should be controls or not. And the reason is that, although I have a personal view, I mean, but or personal feeling, I mean, everybody I think in the room has a personal feeling, but I think that's a very deep political question, a sociological question in each country, whether they want more or whether they want less integration. I think it's not for me as an economist to tell, look, you should have more, or you should have less. My role, and also what our aim in the report, is basically try to shed a bit more light on what are the impact of the decision. So I think in the report we indeed discuss very clearly that the integration of lower qualified people is much more difficult and much less successful than the integration of high qualified people. For example, I showed you the table that you asked a question, we'll come back to that. But on the next slide, I have the same data for tertiary educated people. So the slide I showed for the total population, which again, as I showed, it's sometimes dominated by low qualified people. If you look at just the high tertiary people, they have much better integrated, much better labor market outcomes, even in Italy and Belgium. Not as good again as in Sweden or the UK, but even Italy and Belgium and other countries, integration of higher educated people is much smoother. So, and again, I look forward to hearing Rainer how he believes we could have a chance of changing composition. So just reiterate that we didn't want to take a stand whether control should be introduced or not. I think it's a political decision based on the outcome of what people really want. Another issue on humanitarian asylum. Again, I think in the report we make it very clearly that those who apply for asylum should be assessed very, very thoroughly. And if the decision is no, as you mentioned, Alexandra, in Italy you accept about 40%, and even if they try, they cannot accept more. We say it very clearly that those people who do not qualify for asylum, they should be sent back in a safe way to their original country, which is super difficult and not really happening. But I think we in the report, and also very costly, we are saying very, very clearly that that should be a priority. So we shouldn't just let anyone who wants to enter. In this sense, if someone wants to enter on asylum basis and not qualify for that, I think it's very important to try to keep those people going back where they come from. Now, a few other issues on just maybe a clarification on that. My view was not that Italy should accept more asylums than 40%. My view was that if Hungary accepts 10%, and Sweden accepts 80%, then I can't believe that Hungary and also Poland, they will only accept 15%. I can't imagine that there is such a huge difference that would justify such a big change. Probably Italy is in the middle, Germany is also in the middle, accepting about half, and that could be perfectly right. But there are major deviations from that, and my view was that it cannot be explained by the composition of migrants. And yes, on your view that linguistic and distance and education is very important, and it's also maybe one answer to your question when you ask that why labor market participation is lower in second-generation migrants than third-generation migrants and the natives. Now, if you look at the PISA scores, again, I have a chart, so I invite you to look at my presentation later, which shows what is the PISA score in reading, so in the local language, in Italy, Italian, in Belgium, French or Flemish, of first and second generation migrants, and you see a big gap between natives and people even with second generation migrants. You would think that if a second generation migrant enters, was born in Belgium, 20 years ago, their parents immigrated here 4 decades ago, then he should be absolutely fluent in language, and there are some scores which suggest that Belgian schools are good, but still the PISA outcome shows that they're much lower. So again, if they don't possess a good language skill, that can be, for example, one important reason, as also your research highlighted, for their weaker integration. Another aspect could be that those who are first-generation migrants may have come, many decades ago for work reasons, but somehow since they were not integrated well into the society, their children became segregated, and they were not able to, reach a similar level of integration as their parents. But this is really alarming in my view, that the integration of second-generation migrants is so much worse. I think I will stop here.
Okay, thanks very much, Zsolt. Alessandra, you had some questions that were addressed to you, if you wanted to...
Unfortunately, I have not I would like to start Spain, but I don't have the data on Spain. But I want to recall that linguistic distance is important, but it's also important the segregation. That means the jobs that these people are doing. And if in Spain you have a lot of Latin American coming, in Brazil you have in Portugal the Brazilian coming has a high level of education, so they are integrated into the labor market. While the people coming from Africa, from a colony, they have low-skilled job, and the linguistic distance work as a proxy of human capital. You should do the same also for the level of the education, this distinction by the level of education. But unfortunately, I agree with you that I think more local institution than European institution, because I think the integration is taking place at local level. The problem from my side, from my point of view, is this: a lot is not in many countries is in the hand of benevolent institutions, is not in the hand of the states. If I were in Germany, I would be very happy. Everything is managed by the employment office. The employment office can be efficient or not, but they are everywhere. They train people. If I were a minister, I will introduce a type of literacy test every year, and otherwise you have to follow a course which is compulsory. And in this way, I will able to integrate people. But if I am in another country where the employment office are not working, like in mine, 12% of unemployment rate, 20% in the south, 40% among the young, this means that there is something in the matching system that is not working. The education is self-reference. They educate. The result that he found for the second generation, but at the beginning, the second generation, nobody cared. We didn't have any tailored policy, and there will be it's a small number, because migration in Italy started in the 90s. So now, with the PISA score, you have a very small number of people, because you have at least 20 years. So I will take this number with a lot of care. And so this is all what I want.
Thank you. Arjen, you had some comments?
There was one question, I think, about the... I do think that, well, a lot of developments are rather, I think, predictable in a way. I also like demographic changes occurring in Africa. We know climate change, even though we have different scenarios, we know it's occurring. So but you're right, there are also, of course, the more unforeseen events, such as civil wars. I don't know. Of course, these will be difficult to tackle, and apart from that, we communicate to citizens that such events can happen. It can always happen. Yeah, that's one thing that's important. But the other thing is, I could imagine developments in the future. You know, different ways to redistribute refugees across different countries. Maybe not just in Europe, but also more globally. Who knows? But that could also be a way to reduce the effects of such unpredictable events by kind of an insurance policy for different countries. Yeah.
Thank you, Rainer. Do you want to comment on the moral dilemmas?
Yeah, moral dilemma. But I wanted to make a footnote to Alessandra and Jolt concerning this asylum proxy. When you compare Hungary to Sweden, it's obvious they have the same composition of asylum seekers, because the people have first asked for asylum in Hungary and then later on in Germany, Austria, and Sweden. That's the same population. Yeah, and results in Hungary are low for two reasons. On the one side, the Hungarians don't want to give asylum to send a signal. So that's a kind of a, administrative culture where the courts decide, or the instance deciding are not independent. So they execute what the government line is to a certain degree. We could think, and that's happening in many other countries as well. That the administrative level taking care of, same in Austria. Yeah, we have almost a 90% rejection rate at first instances these days, despite the fact that the composition of migrants has not changed much, because the government policy has changed on that. So to a certain degree, these first instance decisions reflect a general view of governments on how to deal with the issue. This is why it's more important to look at the second instance decisions, which are different. Whereas when you compare Sweden with Italy, it's a selection effect. People arriving in Italy are not refugees because they don't come. I mean, only 10% is from Syria. Yeah, 90% is from and even smaller fractions from Somalia and Eritrea. And so the large bulk is from Nigeria, from Bangladesh, from Ivory Coast. By the way, Nigeria and Ivory Coast being magnet societies themselves, these are the main destinations of intra-African migrations: Nigeria, South Africa, and Ivory Coast. Nigeria is the richest country in Africa, the largest GDP. Ivory Coast has the largest compound annual growth rate over the last 3 years, which, by the way, sheds light on Arjen's suggestion. Let's work with these countries. The more countries develop, the more people are able to leave. Yeah, let's be sure about that. but only for the next 50 or 60 years. And then after 50, 60 years, like the Italian case that Alessandro has alluded to, then if they reach a GDP of $7,000 to $10,000 per capita a year, then the migration recedes. So this is why throwing money on the problem is maybe not the only way of dealing with it, or at least you have to get into expectation management, because that's the mood into which European countries are now. It's on the one hand tighten borders, on the other hand engage with sending countries by giving money. Yeah, and this is important and helpful, but it will not stem the flow in the short to medium term. At least we have to manage expectation there. Now let me get into moral dilemma and Guntram's question. The search and rescue activities in the central Mediterranean were started by Italy in the late 2013. It was a so-called Operation Mare Nostrum. You had a change of government from Berlusconi to Monti to Letta. And Letta wanted to, and backed by his own electoral constituency, being more humanitarian than people who had voted for Berlusconi, started this operation. And after a year, apparently there was this idea, but we are doing this for all the Europeans. It's quite expensive. We should bring the others on board. And so the Operation Mare Nostrum was then replaced by two EU-led operations, Poseidon and EUNAVFOR Med Sophia. But basically with 50% of the contribution still coming, resources coming from Italy. And the strategy first was to rescue people near the Italian shores. But this was the time when the smugglers were sending people on decommissioned trawlers, large ships with 900 people on board. This is why you had shipwrecks with 500 people dying on the same day in the central Mediterranean, which triggered this response. Then we were saying, but we're going to tow you back, which led to these self-inflicted shipwreckings that the smugglers were doing. Okay, we create a shipwreck and you will not be able to tow you back, creating an additional risk. So we had to rescue the people and bring them to the shores. Then the boats became smaller, fisher boats instead of decommissioned trawlers, and slowly, gradually, the rescue operations moved closer to the Libyan coast. At that time, also involving NGOs for the first time. We're talking about mid-15, late 14, mid-15, things like that. The closest rescue operation that has taken place so far was 700 meters away from the Libyan coast. So there you don't even need a boat, you can swim, if you get rescued there. The reaction of the smugglers was the following. The smugglers said, we just buy via the internet cheap inflatable dinghies from China. So it made the trajectory to Italy easier and cheaper. So it is an unintended consequence of our rescue operation was to make it easier and cheaper to come. Then we had negotiated with China to stop the export of inflatable dinghies to Libya. This was an achievement. There's no inflatable dinghies from China anymore employed. And these inflatable dinghies were never meant to serve as smuggling boats, but to sit on the yachts of posh people and to bring them to the harbor. Now, and as an economist, you shouldn't wonder what happens next, and this gives hope for Libya and its future. For the first time in 2,000 years, now we have an inflatable dinghy industry that has popped up in Libya itself, because they have the raw material, the oil, that's getting out of the soil. Now, what's the difference between an inflatable dinghy from China and one from Libya? The one from Libya is only meant to be used once for 15 kilometers. That's it. But they have no security features, no bicameral system. You poke a hole and the boat disappears in the Mediterranean. And so the rescue operations inadvertently have made it easier, cheaper, and more deadly. And that's the dire consequences. On these 15 to 20 kilometers or 30 kilometers between the Libyan coast and the rescue ships, more people die per 10,000 people trying than ever died on the decommissioned trawlers. It has to do with the low quality of the dinghies, but it also has to do with the following fact that when people came on decommissioned trawlers, there was smugglers on board running the boat. a captain and somebody running the machine. On an inflatable dinghy, you never have a smuggler on board. Yeah? They just look out. The people arrive at the Libyan beach, see the sea for the first time, cannot swim. They're put on the boat, and then people say, you pay a little less, and you steer the boat. And there you see the European ships over there at the horizon. You go there. North is there. Yeah? That's something that has not happened before we started rescuing people. Yeah? And this brings us in a moral dilemma. Getting in is easy because you think it's a humanitarian intervention. It's something that we uphold European values. We rescue people at sea. Getting out of that operation is a lot more difficult. And this is why we are investing now in the Libyan Coast Guard. There we have transformed militias into Coast Guard members. The Al-Jabasi militia now has Libyan government uniforms, which says anti-smuggling unit. The Al-Jabasi militia was one of the militias most involved in smuggling before, so they know exactly how to tackle the issue, things like that. So that's a kind of the next stage of intervention because we want to prevent people from even reaching the high seas. Which might reduce the casualties, but unfortunately then creates the next unintended consequences of very unpleasant situations in Libyan detention camps. Yeah? And so I can continue, talking on that because I've worked a lot on that in the Commission. We have no good answers to the issue. The best would be if the countries of Central and Western Africa would prevent their citizens from leaving. But Europe is not making any efforts to prevent its citizens from leaving the country. So the question is, why would we ask something from Western African governments to invest in exit controls excessively? Yeah? North Korea is doing this, but I think it's the only remaining, East Bloc country that still invests a lot in preventing its citizens from leaving. So you see in which paradigm we are beamed back when starting that kind of discourse. The other answer to your second question, that's an easy one. That's completely outside the competences of the European institutions because the admission of third country nationals, be them high or low skilled, is strictly at member states level, including granting asylum to some of them. And so the European level can't do a lot. We can make Europe more attractive maybe on an image base. You know, saying a place to live, a place to invest. Yeah, that's what we would do also when addressing international investors. Yeah, these booklets that you have, places to go, places to live, places to invest your money, something like that. I think that's the only thing we can do. And then we could, engage in a dialogue with member states and going through, and this is done, and you will see this. The DG Home has started a revision of legal migration at member states level, so we'll see a report. But I'm not saying this report's going to change the system in 28 or soon 27 member states. And if you start, and that's a fallacy also of family reunion. If you start with low-educated, able-bodied people to work in your mines or in your agricultural fields, and you later then allow for family reunion, and you wonder that these low-educated, able-bodied people are not married to university graduates, yeah, and then you wonder why family reunion brings more of the same people instead of highly qualified people, then you can say you have made the wrong choice in the first place. But when the choice was made, it was not the wrong choice. Yeah, these people were supplements to Europeans in the 1960s and 70s. And then comes the next generation. The question is, why is family reunion continuing? Because we have these are communities where arranged marriages between diasporas here, the children of diasporas here, and families or villages or clans back there at the origins of the parents are common. Something that most native-born European children would not accept, that their grandparents are choosing a distant relative to be the mate. Whereas we have people living in cultures in Europe, born here, in Belgium, in France, in Germany, where this is part of their culture and it's accepted. Yeah, it's accepted, and that's the way it comes. And so the continuation of family reunion is a constant thing, although the last wife of a guest worker recruit in the 60s is already here, or they have both died in the meantime. It can only be explained by the formation of new family. Now, it's a big headache for integration, because these people freshly admitted, guess what? They speak Arabic, they speak Tamil, they speak whatever language, but they don't speak the language of the country where the grooms and brides are sent to. And then they have children, and guess what? They speak their native language then with the children instead of the language of the country. So we are continuing an integration headache by that kind of family formation. But still, you can say it's rights-based. It's based on human rights, on European values, on European conventions that we have signed. Still, one could ask itself, could the member states have at least find a screw, asking for linguistic competences before giving visas and things like that? There is a margin of maneuver. Again, nothing for the European level. Nothing to be harmonized. That's for the member states. So we decided we can only invite them to do so by showing some of the consequences that are in the report and the data of your OECD and Alessandro has shown. So I think we should use our data in order to convince the politicians that there is at least a couple of kilometers or miles to go, and that the effort might be worth the mile to go. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Eva, do you have any last thoughts before we close for lunch?
I think it's fine.
It's fine. Okay. Well, it's okay. Thanks very much. And again, thank you very much for very interesting and different, actually, comments that come here. And I hope this will be very informative for next week that we pick up. Again, thank you for joining us. And